What is the debate about the origins of war?
I see there's sort of two central areas of disagreement. One is whether you look at recent nomadic foragers, recent nomadic hunter gatherers, whether they had war, whether they practiced war. So, on the one hand, you have people that say, the vast majority of hunter gatherer societies lacked war. The alternative camp is that war was something that was much more common and frequent among hunter gatherers. And that touches on the second point of disagreement, which is really whether war was important in human evolution. I think that there's reason, just like we think human societies make war today, there's reasons to think we were probably doing something similar 50,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, possibly much deeper. But I think the characterizations of nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle as being one of chronic warfare, they don't accurately reflect the ethnographic record. I don't think the evidence supports that sort of like strong Hobbesian position. And Fry has done a really great job of forcing me to think about that and confront that evidence. Nonetheless, we still have like outstanding disagreements.
What do people like Fry, what do people like me, who has been very sympathetic with Fry's research, what do we get wrong when we read the ethnographic literature around modern-day hunter-gatherers and say, look, these are surprisingly peaceful people?
Yeah, so these are hunter-gatherers who have been studied either by anthropologists or by missionaries or by government workers, say in the past couple of 100 years. And people like Fry think that the most important types of societies is not just hunter-gatherers, but hunter-gatherers that are mobile. They move around, they don't store any food, they typically don't live in one place very long. So the vast majority of those societies, when they were studied, were already incorporated into state societies or surrounded by powerful agricultural neighbors. So you can have, say, like the San or the Bushmen or the Kung, who have been really extensively studied. We have a lot of demographic data on them, and we see that there's really not a lot of evidence of war recently, but at the same time, they're living within state society. They're living within Botswana and Namibian government. If you're thinking about what does that group tell you about how humans in a world of hunter-gatherers, how humans 50,000 years ago may have acted when it comes to intergroup relationships, they're not going to be that great of a model, right? They may be a great model for how does parenting work? How does foraging work? But they're not going to be that good of a model for intergroup relationships.
Let me push back a little bit. It's not like the Sun had no one to fight, or it's not like the Mbuti had no one to fight against. They can fight against other Mbuti people or other San people. Let me take, for example, Central African kind of rainforest hunter-gatherers. I had Cecilia Padilla Iglesias on the show, who has done some great work with them. And couple of conclusions from her work, if I may summarize, is they travel a lot. They travel just areas that are kind of unimaginably large for us, meeting other. She wouldn't even want to really say groups, if I understand. She was like she said she used color as an analogy. It's not like you have red and then you have yellow. You have a kind of gradient going from one to the other. And in these kinds of dynamics, I think that someone like Fry might come and say, look, they live in this big web of people very peacefully. And if it would be true that humans are relatively inclined for war, then you would expect humans living in a rainforest to form these kind of groups where they start warring. But lo and behold, when you live without food surplus, when you live without much storage, you actually end up forming these kind of quite peaceful networks of people. And that's evidence that this is kind of what they were probably doing 20,000 years ago when their ancestors were living in those same rainforests. And they have states by them, but if something happens in the rainforest, there's not going to be a policeman knocking on anyone's door, is my guess. But you correct me.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I think the areas that you have ethnographic records on are it's going to be vanishingly small where you could have something that looks like war that's not going to invoke the state.
Okay. But what about then the characterization of them, the fact that they don't end up clustering in these very clear identities, people need each other, go from camp to camp, suggests that maybe that's what the world looked like more 20,000, 30,000 years ago, where you have relatively low population densities, people move from place to place, and the general tendency is to try to find a way to communicate with someone and not form groups which could then even potentially wage war, because you don't necessarily get those kind of clear groups.
Yeah, so I would say, first off, with their social structure, they could still wage war. All you require is the capacity to form coalitions and to use aggression strategically. Nonetheless, the fact that they don't have really distinct social groups isn't incompatible with the fact that war may have been important in human evolution. What you expect is warlike behaviors to emerge in certain sort of conditions. And those conditions may just be met in the Central African rainforests.
Do the hunter-gatherers fight about? Because there is the case that look like, if especially if you're nomadic, you're not defending anything, you have the most obvious conflict resolution mechanism, which is walking away. You don't have centralized leadership who's going to force you because they have a ego stake in the game to go and fight for them. And you're not going to steal anything because there's not much food surplus. You're not going to enslave people and force them to walk with you around the forest. I mean, there is a kind of almost like logic-based argument. What do you think of the value of that?
I can imagine instances where, groups may come together at a water hole. Maybe there's not enough water for all of the members of groups, and this leads to a conflict between them that then results in a series of, retaliatory violence.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But I think for me, there's a deeper problem with the nomadic egalitarian model, the nomadic hunter-gatherer model, where groups, they're living not just in state societies, but they're living in these really resource scarce environments. They're not the place you think humans would settle first, which is typically, resource abundant areas. You think the alternative model is that humans would probably settle in places that are more resource abundant, such as river valleys. And then they may stay there until sort of the carrying capacity is reached that they have to move on. So these would be like semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers who've been studied a lot and typically have much higher rates of intergroup violence.
Yeah, people like Fry would agree the sedentary hunter-gatherers do have higher rates of war. So if that was a more common lifestyle in the human past, that would be a very important part of the puzzle. But there is the point still, but when we look at archaeology, it just doesn't really seem to leave remains of much sedentarism before 10, 20, 12,000 years.
That's a formidable challenge. And I'd like to say that, there is some evidence more than you may realize or more than a night reader may realize. I had a paper published in 2022 with Manvir Singh and Evolution of Human Behavior, where we documented, several dozen hunter-gatherer societies that had evidence of increasing sociopolitical complexity. Every year, it seems like there's more and more research coming out indicating that, like, wow, there are there's more societies than we would have thought that had levels that were somewhat sedentary. For instance, I don't know if you saw this paper came out a year or two ago of a notched log at 400 and some thousand years ago.
100,000, that's before almost.
It's absolutely incredible. And the authors hypothesize it was, part of probably a fishing platform or some sort of, structure. But the fact that it's actually a log, it's not a small sapling like you would find, say, the San used to construct their huts, but, an actual large log.
And it's an important point. Before we lose listeners into the weeds, I think it's important to just say that it has it's a very clear logical relationship with war, which is that there's a kind of fair enough argument, which is that if you have nothing to defend, you can just move away. But it is immediately when you start having a clear, like, say, this is my fishing platform. I put a lot of work with my buddies to create this fishing platform. Well, now you have something to defend, which someone else might want to take, which would potentially make war more likely.
Yeah. So there's a couple of other issues on the lack of very good evidence for semi-sedentary societies. And another is that just many of those areas are the first places that get pushed under agricultural land. You can think of like the Nile, whatever may have been there from 20,000 years ago, we're probably not gonna find. The third is more of a theoretical consideration. It's that the population density may be very, very different between a densely populated river valley and, say, area the size of the Kalahari Desert that has, that's the home of the sun. If you have a very densely populated area next to a lightly populated area, the sort of impact evolutionarily from that densely populated area is going to be likely to be much more significant.
So even if there was a couple of examples of sedentary hunter-gatherers or semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers, they might actually be a big part of the overall pot of people.
Yeah.
Even if there's not very many sites. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Fair enough.
There's not a lot of evidence for war in Paleolithic art. You find it for hunting, you find it for maybe other things, but you don't find it. You do find it in war, but it emerges much more sort of recently.